Objection to counting the electoral votes of the state of Arizona. We, a member of the House of Representatives and a United States Senator, object to the counting of the electoral votes of the state of Arizona on the ground that they were not, under all of the known circumstances, regularly given.
Are there further objections to the certificates from the state of Arizona? The chair hears none. The two houses will withdraw from joint session. Each house will deliberate separately on the pending objection and report its decision back to the joint session. The Senate will now retire to its chamber.
Throughout the day. What's the point?
Well, a few things. First of all, this is supposed to be something that just happens and we pay very little attention to it because it's just a formality. It's in essence one of America's first award shows. You open the envelope, you see who the winner is, you declare that winner, and you swear them in on January 20th.
Except there's no surprise.
In this case, there's no surprise.
We know who the winner is in every envelope.
Right. Today is obviously a little different. And I think more than anything, what it is a living embodiment of sort of the nooks and crannies of our rules and the constitutional roadmap, if you will, that's been laid out. And we're going to see the various guardrails of this get tested, and they're going to get scraped up a little bit. But as we have said, and we will say repeatedly, we know who the winner is. They're objecting on behalf of constituents who believe, and they're in the streets of Washington today and they're across the country, who believe that the president's victory was stolen from him. And we should point out, the president-elect is in Wilmington, Delaware today doing a quick economic event and is not going to speak about this.
Right. I think it's also important to point out, Major, that many of these lawmakers who have been around for a while know that the best way to deal with, including Republicans, to deal with President Trump is to just let the process work, and slowly, knowing that the outcome has already been decided. And Pence, the statement that he's put out, the way he just said this is not a forum for debate, this joint session of Congress, is indicating he's going to slowly just let the process reach the preordained outcome.
Precisely, because that's what the Constitution and the governing law of this country requires. Again, as I said when we opened this broadcast, that ought not to be news. President Trump has forced that to be a newsworthy event. That is something all of us should stop and behold. And yes, the process will play itself out, but it will not be without cost. Nor this will continue to stoke a sense of grievance and a sense of misplaced deception about what happened in this election. And people will cling to that. And it will mar and affect in a negative way the way we think about every future election until we wring it out of our system. the president is intentionally injecting falsehoods into the way we think about the voices of our country and how they're counted and how they create a new presidency. That is not a small matter. It is of enormous import.
And so why would Senator Hawley, who has an Ivy League law degree and
clerk for Supreme Court Justice, yep,
as well as Senator Ted Cruz, who also has an Ivy League law degree, why would they sign on to this process to object to these electoral votes? There
are two working theories. One, trying to win the first primary of 2024, whether President Trump is involved or not, to stake out a place of fighting on behalf of President Trump and the many, many Trump supporters who believe something is amiss. That's one theory. The other theory is, if you make this fight and you know it's going to lose, but you've created a mindset in state legislatures across the country, many of which are still governed by Republicans, to fight for tighter restrictions on voter access, you have made the turf for the midterm election in 2022 and the presidential election in 2024 possibly better for Republicans. That is a more strategic way to think about it. I think you can apportion those in whichever way you prefer, but they both know better. They both know this is not part of the Constitution or governing federal law. They know that.
And yet, what Trump has done is caused a major cleave and break and war within the Republican Party, because shortly we are going to hear the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, say he opposes this Republican effort to rebuke this electoral count. You have the very conservative Senator Tom Cotton, also who holds an Ivy League law degree, has said he opposes this effort. And from a political standpoint, he also opposes it because he says, from a political standpoint, if we oppose the electoral college process, do we want the popular vote process? Probably not, since most Republicans have lost in the presidential popular vote, including in this past one when Joe Biden has, at this point, 7 million more votes in the popular vote.
Not only that, there has never been a role for Congress to insert itself and eradicate the time, manner, and place that states conduct the elections, which is the clear language of the Constitution. And Republicans at the highest level in the House and Senate will publicly disagree about this. And this will be the fisticuffs in the post-Trump era that will determine whether the Republican Party survives.
Let's now touch base with David Becker. He is an election law expert and a CBS News contributor. David, to be clear, nothing can be done today to overturn the presidential election results, correct?
That's exactly right. This is purely ceremonial. The vice president clearly has accepted that and is playing his appropriate role right now as president of the Senate and presiding over this. We are opening the envelopes. The certifications have been at the National Archives for almost a month. All of the states have certified these results. Arizona in particular is interesting because Arizona is a state with a Republican governor and a Republican-dominated legislature that set these rules and saw very few changes in how they ran this election this year compared to 2016. And Representative Gosar, you just heard, objected to this election, an election in which he actually won in his district. So he's on the same exact ballots using the same exact election rules. I think Major's exactly right. This is very damaging.
And David, you raise such an interesting point because the same is true in Georgia, which of course is also run by Republicans, not only by the governor, but also the Secretary of State, and a number of the election officials and legislators are run by the Republican Party. This gives us an opportunity to talk about the other big story of the day that will determine who controls the United States Senate. In case you were sleeping through most of the night and missed the call we made in the middle of the night, CBS News projects that Reverend Warnock has won the seat there, and we have not yet projected the other Senate race there. We can show you the current vote tallies right now at this hour, and Ed O'Keefe has been following what happened in Georgia. Republicans were confident they had spent an enormous amount of money that they would be able to hold on to this, but the Democratic Party was able to pull out their voters.
They were. I mean, we say it, it's a cliche, it all comes down to turnout, and they turned out exactly what they needed.
Specifically?
Black voters, younger voters, voters in and around metro Atlanta, and women. Who all overwhelmingly supported the Democratic candidates, Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. You look at the exit polls. We asked questions, the networks did, about things in the news. Mm-hmm. More than 7 in 10 Georgia voters said they were very or somewhat confident that the votes would be counted accurately. 84% believed the presidential election in November was conducted fairly. That flies in the face of the public statements made over the last several weeks by the president. And so it shows that voters were listening. As one senior Republican aide said to me a little while ago, or a Republican campaign consultant, he said, turns out clinically insane things cut through, because that's what the president was saying. Don't believe the results of the election in November, don't turn out to vote. Well, Democrats turned out just enough people. Also notable, this was a higher educated electorate, so a sign that people who tend to favor Democrats, but in the past had favored Republicans, are turning out for these Senate candidates, and it creates a whole new set of opportunities for Democrats here in Washington.
As you're speaking, I just want to pull up the live pictures of protesters, Trump supporters walking up Pennsylvania Avenue as they are going from the Washington ellipse, where they just heard from President Trump, up to the United States Capitol, where that action is happening today. This is why the mayor of the District of Columbia has asked for help from essentially it's the Secretary of the Army, who is called the governor of the D.C., to call in the National Guard for help there. D.C. has a strict no weapons rule, and that has already ensnared the head of the Proud Boys, who brought ammunition in and has been barred from the District of Columbia. I want to go to Chris Van Cleve. He is in the middle of the protest there to give us a sense about the size and what he's seeing. Chris?
People out here at the Capitol growing as the president wrapped up his speech. People began coming up this way. You can see behind us here, we're on the far side of the Capitol from the shot you were just showing. And this crowd has been here for hours, but it has been growing steadily. And you're seeing a wide variety of people. You are seeing some folks show up in combat helmets, in what appears to be body armor. I have seen some people with holsters, although nothing in the holster. D.C. Police have been pretty adamant about the gun laws here in the district and people not to bring weapons to the Capitol grounds, of course. We have heard some reports of some tense moments between police and protesters, but so far, for the most part, it has been a peaceful gathering. Everything from praying and singing to pro-President Trump chants as the crowd outside of the Capitol continues to grow. Nora?
And there you have it. An extraordinary number of Trump supporters have gathered here in Washington. They were encouraged by social media to show up, and it just so happens that it comes this January 6th, the day that Congress counts the electoral votes, one day after this incredibly important set of elections in Georgia. At this hour, CBS News has not characterized that second race, but is saying that it leans towards the Democratic candidate.
John Ossoff, yes.
Yes, and what's noteworthy, too, let us get the news in for everybody, too, knowing what the Democrats feel in terms of they feel confident at this hour that they will be able to have a 50-50 split in the Senate, right, with Kamala Harris as the vice president casting the tie-breaking vote. You hear the Vice President Biden, now President-elect Joe Biden, announcing who will be his choice for Attorney General.
Merrick Garland. If that name sounds somewhat familiar to those in our audience, there's a reason for that. He was nominated by President Obama from the D.C. Court of Appeals to be a Supreme Court justice. You might recall the Republican Senate majority, led by Mitch McConnell, denied him even the courtesy of a hearing, let alone a vote. And that name and that incident, that episode, has burned in the partisan hearts of Democrats ever since. His nomination as Attorney General puts him back in the mix and puts the incoming Biden administration on the position of saying, not only are we going to revisit a wound of politics that we believe was wrongly placed on us, we're going to put someone who is deeply experienced in the law and has been a judge at the second highest federal court in the land and in charge of the Justice Department.
And he'll get Republican votes.
He will.
I spoke with one McConnell associate this morning who says, in this case, Mitch McConnell might actually vote for Merrick Garland because he is so above the partisan warfare of the last several years, having been a career federal prosecutor back in the day, prosecuted Timothy McVeigh and the Unabomber in the 1990s, has served on that court, that in this case, he is seen as somebody that would be acceptable.
I mean, it's symbolic in so many ways, because if the Democrats are able to get that 50-50 split, control it, it will make appointing Biden's choices to his cabinet much easier. It will make some of his legislative goals and achieving them much easier. It's not a slam dunk by any means.
I would say easier on nominations. Legislation will still be very, very complicated, very, very tough, because a 50-50 split means you're essentially a constantly divided Senate body. You not only need 60 votes, but there's a long way from 50 to 60. But on setting the calendar and putting nominations on the floor, which you do for cabinet appointees and judicial appointees, Democrats will control that calendar. That is a tremendous amount of leverage. That's why, for Democrats, and from their perspective, these two runoff races in Georgia were so important to the future of the Biden administration.
So incredibly important. And what does that mean for the Biden team at this hour? 2 weeks before he's to be inaugurated, knowing now that they are this close to having a very slim majority. It's not even a majority, but they will have a deciding majority with the vice president.
Yeah, I asked one of the president-elect senior advisors this morning, I said, how would the president-elect deal with these Republicans who are doing this today, who are contesting reality? And he texted back very simply, those voting to certify make a large bipartisan majority. And I think that's important to remember, that enough Democrats and Republicans today are banding together to say, no, reality is Joe Biden won. And it's that bipartisan majority that they believe they'll still be able to work with on things like immigration, climate change, obviously the response to the coronavirus and the economic rebuilding that needs to happen. And so they remain pretty confident that if he can still appear to be above the fray, the president at least, he can try cutting deals.
That's laudably optimistic, but the simple truth is adherence to the Constitution and federal law ought not to be a significant requirement for anyone who takes oath to serve the United States Congress or the United States Senate. And these Republicans know that's exactly what they're doing, and that's how they're defending it. But when you get down to the brass tacks of legislation and partisan differences, I think they're going to be bleeding back into the McConnell category pretty rapidly. This is a bright line, and they know it. And it ought to be. Mm-hmm. The Constitution is a bright line, the brightest one we have, thank goodness. Mm-hmm. And they are adhering to it. And that bipartisan majority adherence to that is vital and important and will be recorded for all of our history. But I think on an infrastructure bank or on immigration reform, those things are going to have to be worked out bit by bit, partisan by partisan, vote by vote. And that's going to be hard work.
I want to bring in Nicole Killian, who is covering the Biden campaign. And Nicole, what are you hearing from the Biden team about not only the Georgia results, certainly, but what's happening today in Washington?
Well, as far as the Georgia results, a transition official told me earlier today, they really feel that what happened in Georgia overnight really exemplifies the fact that Biden has been able to expand the playing field for Democrats. I mean, first off, he flipped the state back in November, and then to have not one, but potentially two Democratic senators coming into the chamber is really remarkable as far as they're concerned. And they feel that their message of focusing on unity really resonates with those voters. As far as electoral count is concerned, the president-elect has been pretty mum about it, and part of that has been by design, simply for that reason that you've been discussing about. He knows he's going to need Republicans and bipartisanship to get his agenda forward.
Nicole, thank you. And want to go now to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who is speaking.
Years in the Senate. This will be the most important vote I've ever cast. President Trump claims the election was stolen. The assertions range from specific local allegations to constitutional arguments to sweeping conspiracy theories. I supported the president's right to use the legal system. Dozens of lawsuits received hearings in courtrooms all across our country. But over and over, the courts rejected these claims, including all-star judges whom the president himself has nominated. Every election, we know, features some illegality and irregularity, and of course, that's unacceptable. I support strong state-led voting reforms. Last year's bizarre pandemic procedures must not become the new norm. But my colleagues, nothing before us proves illegality anywhere near the massive scale that would have tipped the entire election. nor can public doubt alone justify a radical break when the doubt itself was incited without any evidence. The Constitution gives us here in Congress a limited role. We cannot simply declare ourselves a national board of elections on steroids. The voters, the courts, and the states have all spoken. They've all spoken. If we overrule them, it would damage our republic forever. This election actually was not unusually close. Just in recent history, 1976, 2000, and 2004 were all closer than this one. The electoral college margin is almost identical to what it was in 2016. If this election were overturned by mere allegations from the losing side, our democracy would enter a death spiral. We'd never see the whole nation accept an election again. Every 4 years would be a scramble for power at any cost. The Electoral College, which most of us on this side have been defending for years, would cease to exist, leaving many of our states with no real say at all in choosing a president. The effects would go even beyond the elections themselves. Self-government, my colleagues, requires a shared commitment to the truth and a shared respect for the ground rules of our system. We cannot keep drifting apart into two separate tribes with a separate set of facts and separate realities, with nothing in common except our hostility towards each other and mistrust for the few national institutions that we all still share. Every time in the last 30 years that Democrats have lost a presidential race, they've tried a challenge just like this. After 2000, after 2004, after 2016. After 2004, a senator joined and forced the same debate. And believe it or not, Democrats like Harry Reid, Dick Durbin, and Hillary Clinton praised them and applauded the stunt. Republicans condemned those baseless efforts back then, and we just spent 4 years condemning Democrats' shameful attacks on the validity of President Trump's own election. So look, there can be no double standard. The media that is outraged today spent 4 years aiding and abetting Democrats' attacks on our institutions after they lost. But we must not imitate and escalate what we repudiate. Our duty is to govern for the public good. The United States Senate has a higher calling than an endless spiral of partisan vengeance. Congress will either override the voters, overrule them, the voters, the states, and the courts for the first time ever, or honor the people's decision. will either guarantee Democrats' delegitimizing efforts after 2016 become a permanent new routine for both sides, or declare that our nation deserves a lot better than this. We'll either hasten down a poisonous path where only the winners of election actually accept the results, or show we can still muster the patriotic courage that our forebears showed not only in victory but in defeat. The framers built the Senate to stop short-term passions from boiling over and melting the foundations of our republic. So I believe protecting our constitutional order requires respecting the limits of our own power. It would be unfair and wrong to disenfranchise American voters and overrule the courts and the states on this extraordinarily thin basis. And I will not pretend such a vote would be a harmless protest gesture while relying on others to do the right thing. I will vote to respect the people's decision and defend our system of government as we know it.
Leader.
Mr. President, Vice President, as prescribed by the Constitution and the laws of the nation, the purpose of this joint session is for tellers appointed on a bipartisan basis by the two houses to read to the Congress the results of an election that has already happened. We are here to receive an announcement of a vote that has already been certified by every state in the Union and confirmed by the courts many times over. We're here to watch the current Vice President open envelopes and receive the news of a verdict that has already been rendered. It is a solemn and august occasion, no doubt, but it is a formality. The Congress does not determine the outcome of elections, the people do. The Congress is not endowed with the power to administer elections. Our states are given that power. By the end of the proceedings today, it will be confirmed once again something that is well known and well settled. The American people elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to be the next President and Vice President of the United States. And yet, a number of our colleagues have organized an effort to undermine and object to that free and fair election. They're in the minority. They will lose. They know that. They have no evidence of widespread voter fraud upon which to base their objections. That's because there is none. There is none. Not brought before any of the courts successfully. They know that President Trump and his allies have suffered a defeat in court after court across the country, losing no fewer than 62 legal challenges. And I might add, many Republican-appointed judges, some appointed by President Trump, rendered those decisions. They know, you all know, that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to be sworn in as President and Vice President of the United States on January 20th. But they are going to object to the counting of the vote anyway. And in the process, they will embarrass themselves, they will embarrass their party, and worst of all, they will embarrass their country. This insurrection was fortunately discouraged by the leadership of the majority party, but it was not quelled. It is a very sad comment on our times that merely the accepting the results of an election is considered an act of political courage. Sadder and more dangerous still is the fact that an element of the Republican Party believes their political viability hinges on the endorsement of an attempted coup. That anyone, much less an elected official, would be willing to tarnish our democracy in order to burnish their personal political fortunes. Over the course of the afternoon, and however far into the evening this band of Republican objectors wants to take us, senators of goodwill from both sides of the aisle will explain why these challenges must be dismissed. The senators from states whose electoral votes are being challenged will explain how the allegations of fraud are baseless. And a substantial bipartisan majority must vote to put down these objections and defend the sanctity of our elections and indeed, our great and grand democracy. Because that's what we're talking about today. The health of our democracy. This wonderful, beautiful, grand democracy where the peaceful passing of the torch is extolled by school children in the second grade, but not by some here.
Not right now.
As we speak, half of our voters are being conditioned by the outgoing president to believe that when his party loses an election, the results must not be legitimate. As we speak, the eyes of the world are on this chamber, questioning whether America is still the shining example of democracy, the shining city on the hill. What message we send today? What message will we send today to our people, to the world that has so looked up to us for centuries? What message will we send to fledgling democracies who study our Constitution, mirror our laws and traditions, in the hopes that they too can build a country ruled by the consent of the governed? What message will we send to those countries where democratic values are under assault and look to us to see if those values are still worth fighting for? What message will we send to every dark corner of the world where human rights are betrayed, elections are stolen, human dignity denied? What will we show those people? Will we show those people that there is a better way to ensure liberty and opportunity of humankind? Sadly, a small band of Republican objectors may darken the view of our democracy today, but a larger group of senators and House members from both sides of the aisle can send a message too. That democracy beats deep in the hearts of our citizens and our elected representatives. That we are a country of laws and of not men. That our traditions are not so easily discarded, even by our president. That facts matter. That truth matters. That while democracy allows free speech and free expression, even if that expression is anti-democratic, there will always be, praise God, a far broader and stronger coalition ready to push back and defend everything we hold dear. We can send that message today by voting in large and overwhelming numbers to defeat these objections. My colleagues, we each swore an oath just 3 days ago that we would defend and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that we would bear true faith and allegiance to the same. We swore that we took this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that we could well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office we were about to enter, so help us God. The precise words of that oath were shortly written after the Civil War, when the idea of true faith and allegiance to this country and its Constitution took on enormous meaning. Let those words ring in the ears of every senator today. Let us do our duty to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help us God.
Majority Leader.
I yield up to 5 minutes to the senator from Texas, Senator Cruz.
And there we heard from the two leaders in the United States Senate, including an extraordinarily historic speech by the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who many say has enabled President Trump and what he has done for the past 4 years, but at the same time has gotten through what is his singularly most important legislative agenda, which is hundreds of judges and 3 Supreme Court conservative judges. And yet today saying that we cannot keep drifting apart, and that there is not the type of massive voter fraud that the president alleges that would overturn the results of this election, a rebuke to President Trump.
The president, according to Mitch McConnell, has embraced sweeping conspiracy theories that if they were to succeed, would place American democracy in a death spiral. That's pretty...
Death spiral.
That's about as direct a refutation of the president's repeated and baseless utterances as you could find from the leader of the Senate Republicans. And Mitch McConnell said the vote he's about to cast on this and other objections will be the most important of his 36-year Senate career. The most important, because it is about the Constitution and applicable federal law. And if this were to succeed, this effort, he said every 4 years there would be a scramble within Congress for presidential power at any cost. Well, the cost would be the death spiral of our democracy. That's a pretty direct and very clear-cut explication of the stakes
And at
involved.
the same time, while President Trump is witnessing his closest allies, his vice president, saying that he's going to preside, not to decide, that he's watching the most senior Republican in the Senate say, we're not going down this death spiral, there's no massive fraud. Outside the Capitol, we have a violent situation developing there, where many of them have just heard the president speak outside the White House. They have now moved to the Capitol. We can report at this hour that one of the House of Representatives office buildings, it's called the Cannon House Office Building, it holds a number of congressional offices, that has been evacuated. We are also understanding that some areas around on Capitol Hill, around the Cannon office building, are also being evacuated. I believe Chris Van Cleve is there up on Capitol Hill. And Chris, what have you learned?
Well, Nora, the posture from the Capitol Police has noticeably changed in the last half hour. There is noticeable tension now in the air. We've come around to the other side of the Capitol. This is the side of the Capitol that looks down across the National Mall. There are some Trump supporters that have scaled part of what will be the inauguration stage. We can see a Trump flag being waved up top there. And Maz, if you'll pan across, you can see the crowd stretches down onto at least approaching the National Mall here. So you're talking about thousands of people, the vast majority of them here peacefully gathering. However, we've got some video we want to show you of some tense moments in exchange with Capitol Police here. There had been some talk yesterday about an effort to storm the Capitol. Obviously, this is a very secure facility. It has its own police force. They are out here in force. We've heard the sort of boom and bang noises that often we have heard around protests here that are indicative of perhaps a flashbang sort of sound grenade that police can put off to try to help control a crowd. And we have watched a large number of police flow into the area here. You know, this is, of course, you've got thousands and thousands of people who had gathered here at the Capitol, and the other folks that were on the ellipse that have made their way several blocks up Pennsylvania Avenue here to the Capitol. And you have a very, very large crowd here. Certainly no effort we're seeing to disperse the bulk of the crowd, Nora, but we are hearing some reports of at least some tense moments with police and at least one, possibly two of the office buildings here in the Capitol complex being evacuated as the crowd continues to grow.
Got it. And thank you, Chris Van Cleve. We are now hearing that in that Cannon office building that they have, there is an evacuation all clear. Reentry is authorized. This is from the United States Capitol Police. There was what was believed a bomb threat earlier, in addition to what you see these protesters pushing and storming the Capitol, breaking down the barriers.
Anyone who's worked at the White House, as I have, or Capitol Hill, as Ed has, is aware of the suspicious package phenomenon in D.C. It's not uncommon. That's what this was. It's been dealt with rapidly. We should also note that most of these buildings are thinly occupied because of pandemic protocols. Not that they're vacant, but they're less occupied than they otherwise would be.
Yeah.
But the important distinction to make here is between those who came to the nation's capital to protest peacefully and those who, as you can see in this video, have brought snarling, malicious intent to the nation's capital and want to mix it up with law enforcement to show their fidelity to President Trump. He has inspired some of this passion. And we don't know where it's going to go this afternoon, but these are not encouraging signs.
Yeah, we don't normally see this every day at the Capitol. And
No, we don't.
This is the problem, is this will be seen around the world, this will be seen around the country tonight, and it's isolated, but it's not a good look.
I hesitate to raise this, but one of the things that the president had tweeted was that this would be a wild one, I believe in his words, and encouraging people to come to Washington. I want to bring in our election law expert, David Becker, because one of the concerns that led to the 10 former secretaries of defense to write that letter to say that the military will not get involved, according to sources that I spoke with, was that they were concerned about internal disruptions like this, that there could be an internal or external factor that could push or encourage the president to invoke martial law. Explain what that would mean.
Well, I mean, we've got a situation where the president has been convincing his supporters for many months now that the election was invalid, despite any evidence that would support that. And this is obviously resonating with a lot of his supporters who are legitimately disappointed about his loss and have now been led to believe that this involves some kind of steal. The president has just riled them up in a speech outside the White House, and now we're seeing the mask of this coup being played out right before us, where, as Senator Cruz is arguing on the Senate floor to throw out the votes of millions of American voters, there are angry and militant, violent protesters, not all of the protesters, of course, but some of them, who are now putting the lives of police officers, Capitol police officers, at risk. And I understand that the National Guard might be ready to come in. There had been some called in for this kind of event. It looks like the Capitol Police is handling this well and safely, and I know we're all thinking about their safety as they try to maintain order around the Capitol grounds.
David Becker, thank you for that explanation. We also have some news right now because we've just heard from the president-elect Joe Biden. He has tweeted out that he has weighed in on the results of the election, saying that he called Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff this morning to congratulate them on their hard-fought campaigns. And Ed, significant because they won in Georgia by actually outperforming Joe Biden among young voters, among African-American voters, and even in some of the suburbs.
Absolutely. And it's, a huge sigh of relief for Democrats. Kamala Harris is going to have to spend a lot of time, or maybe more time than she expected, at the Capitol breaking ties. But regardless, this is a huge sort of feather in the cap as they head towards Inauguration Day and prepare to take over. And the bold move made by nominating Merrick Garland, or the plan to nominate Merrick Garland as Attorney General, is a good sign of that, because it also sets off a chain reaction into the courts. Now that Democrats have control of the Senate with the 50 majority rule vote, they can stuff the courts just as Republicans have over the last several years with vacancies. And there's even a movement to push some Supreme Court justices
and we have not
off
yet
the court.
projected that John Ossoff has won yet. If the Democrats were to achieve a 50-50 split with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker, what would be the top legislative agendas? What could this country, those watching, say would change?
Well, the Biden transition team has identified dealing with the pandemic aggressively. Chuck Schumer has said $2,000 stimulus checks is a high priority item, infrastructure, things of that kind. But the election has to be called first. They have to be sworn in. We should be careful about that. It is looking that way, but we should be careful about that.
That's right. They have not only mentioned infrastructure, as you pointed out, in the pandemic, but those $2,000 checks, which certainly those two Democratic candidates in Georgia made as a selling point in the very waning days of the campaign. And so the debates go on in both the House and Senate, and likely will for some time. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell giving that extraordinarily historic speech, warning that democracy could go into a death spiral if Congress repeatedly objects to the elections, sending a message not only to the country and his party, but probably also those suburban voters that have flocked away from his party in these last couple of elections. What happens today will not change the election. Joe Biden will be inaugurated as president 2 weeks from today. We will continue to cover today's news. It will continue on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN, and you can watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app. And there will be more on your local news and a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a special report. I'm Nora O'Donnell, CBS News, Washington.
And I rise with a simple question. Can the chair honestly tell Americans that with pending Supreme Court legislation or pending Supreme Court case over legal observers not being allowed to observe and inspect signatures, that the laws and Constitution of that state were not violated to change voting outcomes? Madam Speaker, I will wait for a response.
I'm sorry? Gentleman has 25 seconds remaining.
Madam Speaker, I will repeat my question. Can you honestly tell Americans that with pending Supreme Court case over legal observers not being able to observe and inspect signatures, that the laws and Constitution of Arizona did not be violated to change voting outcomes? And I will wait for a response.
Okay. The gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the objection.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, today is an important day. In 1862, during the depths of the Civil War, President Lincoln submitted his annual message to Congress, to this body, and in it he wrote the following. In spite of ourselves. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best of earth. We gather today, Madam Speaker, to ensure the survival of our grand American experiment, the greatest democracy this world has ever known. And there are millions of people watching today's proceedings. The eyes of the world are on us now, my colleagues, wondering if we will keep the faith, wondering if our constitutional republic will hold. Will we adhere to our Constitution, that solemn, visionary document that has guided us so well for so long and enabled the peaceful transfer of power for the last 230 years? Will we continue to be a country premised on the consent of the governed, a Congress that respects the will of the people, and a republic that will endure? Those are the questions before us today, Madam Speaker. With respect to my new colleague from Colorado, the question is not whether Joe Biden was elected the 46th President of the United States. He clearly was. The people of Arizona, like so much of the country, spoke clearly and resoundingly. They voted in record numbers. And over 81 million Americans selected Joe Biden as the next president. Now, today we hear from some in this chamber, not all, but some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, vague claims of fraud. No substance, no evidence, no facts, no explanation for why over 88 judges across this land have rejected the very same claims. Madam Speaker, the bottom line is this. As my colleague Representative Raskin so eloquently put it, the people have spoken. And that is why on December 14th, the Electoral College met to certify the election of a duly elected president, just as they've done for centuries during terrible world wars, recessions, depressions, plagues, and pandemics. They met their duty, and they once again rose to the occasion and certified the election. And the question now is, will we do ours? Now, I know there are many textualists among us, many of my colleagues, who would understand that the Constitution must guide our work today. And the Constitution is crystal clear. Our duty today is a narrow one. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 reads, "The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the President." That's it. Period. Our job is not to replace the judgment made by the American people with our own. And yet that is precisely what so many of my House and Senate Republican colleagues ask this body to do, to substitute their judgment for the expressed will of the American people. In America, we don't do that. In the United States, we accept the results of free and fair elections. We don't ignore the will of the voters, Madam Speaker, and attempt to install a preferred candidate into power. That doesn't happen here. I will close with this. Our duty, our task, is a very simple one: to honor the voice of the people, to honor our Constitution, to count the votes, certify this election, and begin to heal this great country of ours. I pray each of us may find the courage to do so. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Okay. Yeah. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the objection.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, we have a solemn responsibility today. We must vote to sustain objections to states of electors submitted by states that we genuinely believe clearly violated the Constitution in the presidential election of 2020. This is the threshold legal question before us, and it's an issue before us for the state of Arizona. We got to repeat this for emphasis because a lot of people seem to be confused. Because judges and not the state legislature changed the rules of the election, Arizona clearly violated the plain language of Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution in its selection of presidential electors. The framers of our Constitution recognized that elections were susceptible to corruption. We all know that. So how did they fix it? How did they provide for that? They created the Electoral College as a safeguard, and they expressly empowered state legislatures to ensure the integrity of our unique election system. Only the state legislatures, because they're a full body of representatives and not rogue officials, were given the authority to direct the manner of appointing presidential electors because it was so important. The Supreme Court has acknowledged this over and over. They previously affirmed in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, quote, "The appointment of these electors is thus placed absolutely and wholly with the legislatures of the several states. That authority can never be taken away or abdicated." The Arizona legislature did enact detailed rules and procedures that state was determined and was supposed to follow to choose its electors. But in the months preceding the 2020 election, as we've heard, and by the way, 1,000 pages of evidence have just been submitted on the facts on this, those well-established rules and procedures were deliberately changed. They weren't changed by the legislature, friends. They were changed by judges. And those actions taken by the judiciary were not limited to mere interpretations of existing law. No, they were substantive, wholesale changes to those statutes. That's a usurpation of the authority that the legislature had. That usurpation was repeated across the country this year. It's the primary reason. It's one of the reasons why the election of 2020 became riddled with an unprecedented number of serious allegations of fraud and irregularities all over the country. National polls, as has been said, indicate that a huge percentage of Americans now have serious doubts about not just the outcome of this presidential contest, but also the future reliability of our election system itself. Since we are convinced that the election laws in Arizona and some other key states were changed in this unconstitutional manner, We have a responsibility today. The slates of electors produced under those modified laws are thus unconstitutional. They are, quote, not regularly given or lawfully certified as required by the Electoral Count Act, and they're invalid on their face. That's just the conclusion that you have to reach. Given these inescapable facts, we believe we have no choice today but to vote to sustain objections to those slates of electors. Mr. Raskin and others today have cited the 12th Amendment, and they cite Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3. Remember that, Clause 3, and they've asserted that Congress has only one narrow role today. We're just supposed to count the electoral votes that have been submitted. But those advocates have overlooked a critical first principle. Their assertion is only true so long as Congress first is convinced that the electoral votes that are produced by a process that violated the Constitution is there. We got to get through Clause 2 of Article 2, Section 1 before we get to Clause 3 is the point. Look, in our unique system, Congress is positioned as the last bulwark in a presidential election to ensure the Constitution has been followed. Indeed, in just two decades ago, the Supreme Court spoke to this. They plainly acknowledged this important deliberative role of Congress. It was the famous Bush v. Gore litigation that everybody remembers from 2000. In a per curiam opinion, meaning all 9 justices, it was unanimous. They noted strict adherence to the provisions of the Electoral Count Act may, quote, create a safe harbor for a state insofar as congressional consideration of its electoral votes is concerned. However, they said, unanimously, the court said, since Title III, Section 5 contains a principle of federal law that would assure finality of the state's determination if they followed all the prescriptions there, if a legislature, the will of the legislature is attempted to be changed by a state court, that is a problem. That, they said, Congress might deem to be a change in the law. That's precisely why we're here right now. Go read Bush v. Gore and you'll see this. Chief Justice William Rehnquist and Scalia and Thomas joined in a concurring opinion 8 days later, and they reiterated this point. A significant departure from the legislature's scheme for appointing presidential electors presents a federal question. It's a big problem for us, and it's one we cannot get around. That's why we're here. I urge my colleagues today to look at the facts, to follow the law, and follow our congressional oath. We're supposed to support and defend the Constitution. That's what we do here today. I urge everyone to do the right thing, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona, the Dean of the Arizona delegation, seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to the objection.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This exercise in futility that Congress is undertaking is at the behest of Republican members of Congress. The effort to overturn the presidential election and grant Donald Trump 4 more years is the motivation behind it. And to continue a baseless, conspiracy-fueled threat to our democracy makes no sense, because there is no viable constitutional or legal path to overturn the election that will make Vice President Biden and Senator Harris President and Vice President of the United States after January 20th. One certain outcome of this whole process is the weakening of our democracy and the threatening of our democracy. Beginning with Arizona, Congress is being asked to chase down a rabbit hole, baseless, discredited, and judicially discarded fringe conspiracy theories. But for the record, let's talk a little bit about Arizona. Arizona and state and local officials did an unbelievable job to ensure that the 2020 elections ran smoothly. Mr. Hickman, the Republican chairman of the Maricopa County Party, the largest county in the state of Arizona, said, no matter how you voted, this election was administered with integrity, transparency, and in accordance with state laws. Arizona showed up to the polls in record numbers. More than 3.4 million people voted, increases in every county, and 65% of all eligible voters in Arizona voted in the 2020 election. Arizona's cast their ballots up and down for Republicans and Democrats, and 11 electoral votes were granted to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris based on their victory in Arizona. That's the story. Arizona voted in hundreds of races this year, And in addition to the presidency, these races include 9 members of the state's congressional delegation that are with you. 4 of them, my Republican colleagues. These members have already been seated in the 117th Congress. They do not question the accuracy of Arizona's 220 elections to select a congressional delegation, yet my 4 Republican colleagues question the presidential election. Our colleagues may say they are only asking questions and seeking to reassure voters. But let us be clear, these questions have been answered by the voters and by the courts. Rather than accepting the answers and the results of the election, they are fanning the flames of unfounded suspicion and once again creating a threat, a very real and dangerous threat to our democracy. Again, our friends do not question the outcomes of their own elections. That is, because they have no reason to, just as they have no legitimate reason to question the results of the presidential election in Arizona. I ask my colleagues to reject this objection, to respect the will of the voters in the state of Arizona and throughout this country, and to fundamentally add some preservation to our democracy from any future damage that this effort that we are undertaking in this House today and in the Senate today does not further damage our democracy. Now yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of my objection.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I filed my petition, a challenge on the slate of electors from the state of Arizona that was actually put forward by Governor Ducey of Arizona. My ask to you, the Speaker, to the Vice President, is simple. Do not count these electors until and unless the Secretary of State allows a forensic audit of the election, a request she has denied repeatedly. We have been told over and over that even though this was a public election, using public money on public machines, utilizing public employees, the public today has no ability to simply double-check the veracity of these results. If the presidential election was a football game, we would get a slow-motion review from multiple angles and a correction of a controversial decision. But not so, we are told by our Secretary of State for the presidential election. No review for you. No access to the Dominion voting machines with a documented history of enabling fraud through its now discredited adjudication system, a system that literally allows one person to change tens of thousands of votes in a mere minutes. In the only audit done in Arizona, a court found 3% error rate against President Trump. Vice President Biden's margin of error was 1/10 of that, at 0.03%. By the way, a 3% error rate at minimum is 90,000 ballots. After finding the 3% error rate, the court stopped the audit and refused to go further. In Arizona, as my attachments make clear, mail-in ballots were altered on the first day of counting, as shown in data graphs we provide, and is concluded by data analysts. Over 400,000 mail-in ballots were altered, switched from President Trump to Vice President Biden, or completely erased from President Trump's totals. The proof is in the counting curves, the curves that cannot occur except with odds so rare and unlikely that winning the Mega Millions lottery is more probable. Mr. Speaker, can I have order in the chamber?
The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Okay. The House will be in order. House will be in order. Members will take their seats. The House will be in order. Okay. Okay. We can get order. We can resume. Without objection, the chair declares the House in recess pursuant to Clause 12B of Rule 1.
And in that case, a couple of southern states had sent up alternative ballots, disputed ballots, and Congress solved the problem by setting up this commission with, as you say, 15 members. And they ended up picking the president themselves, those 15. That process was so messy that Congress later came back and changed the laws. Oh, go on. Changed laws. They came up with the Electoral Count Act to establish a process for resolving situations when there were alternative slates of electors. So Ted Cruz is going back to an earlier period of time that he seems to feel should be the model. I will say it does ignore some of